Welcome back to Powered by Play. I'm Drew, and I'm a professor of theater at Chapman University in Southern California.
I'm Avery, and I'm a theatrical scenic designer. Every month on this podcast, we explore what we play, how we play, and why we play.
We believe play powers us, and that's what makes it powerful.
All right, Drew.
All right, Avery.
Press play. Today we are talking about playing with fantasy. So how do humans use fantasy to play with the world and their desires in it? What makes some powerful fantasies permissible while others are condemned by our governments or our parents? How deep can people dive into the world of fantasy while still staying safe? And when is it time to return to reality? We're here to discuss everything from the most idyllic, pleasant, happy fantasy worlds to those that are full of danger and challenge every ounce of strength that we have.
Oh boy, there's a lot to say. I thought I would start with a quote from Ursula Le Guin. Now, I'm going to cite Ursula a couple of times in this episode, and most of what I'm quoting is from her essay, Why Are Americans Afraid of Dragons?, which was written in 1975. And so I'll begin with this one. It is by such statements as, once upon a time there was a dragon, or in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. It is by such beautiful non-facts that we fantastic human beings may arrive in our peculiar fashion at the truth. In this quote, I love beautiful non-facts, Avery. I think that just sums up fantasy really, really well. So let's talk about what we mean by fantasy, shall we?
Yeah. There's a couple different things that we could mean when we refer to the word fantasy. We could be referring to the genre, which is I would describe it as where the world and the characters and the creatures in this storytelling medium resemble far from reality. They don't really subscribe to any realistic ideas of who we are on this planet in this specific universe that we live in, governed by the rules of the science that we know and love. Or we could be referring to the psychology of fantasy, which is the way that our minds play in our day-to-day lives, where we're possibly daydreaming or we're in our heads idealizing something that we really want or something that we have felt in the past, where we're trying to escape from one status to enjoy a different status. And so that could mean that you escape your chaotic present-day life in order to fantasize about a satisfying, peaceful life, like living in a cottage in the woods. A lot of people have had that fantasy, especially after the 2020 pandemic, where we sort of had a little bit of that cottage in the woods feeling where everybody was in their own homes and having to kind of make their life the best as they could by themselves. But there was also, I think the thing between that is like technology and modern societal norms and stuff. And so the fantasy about living in a cottage in the woods, it's like a completely different world that you can live in inside your head.
Oh, absolutely. For me, what distinguishes fantasy from straight-up fiction or other kinds of genres is that it focuses on magic. So I usually think of science fiction as focusing on technology, and fantasy, the magic in fantasy extending to, it's everywhere. Creatures and artifacts like cursed weapons or magic weapons, large world systems, raw magic that sort of courses through worlds and things like that. And when I think of magic, I think of it as being ancient, being wild, being powerful, and being exclusive. So I think of magic as being there in the world before humans, or whatever the human equivalent characters are in the fantasy narrative. And magic will be there after. Magic will be there after the humans. I think that it's often linked with power, and it's often linked with destiny. So questions about who gets to use magic and why. Do you just need to be given a magic weapon? Is that enough? Or Do you have to train? Do you have to have some kind of affinity for it? I'm thinking of Star Wars here. Do you need to be force sensitive, right? Do you need to have something that pulls you towards that magic or the power? And how are the magic world and the non-magic world demarcated? What are the boundaries between them? There are a lot of different examples of worlds where part of the populace knows that magic exists and part does not. And sometimes that's urban fantasy where you'll have kind of people living in a suburban area. I'm thinking maybe Twilight here, that may be verging too much into gothic. But you have some people who are like, oh yeah, there's a war going on. And some people who just kind of think, oh, this is part of everyday life. So that would be, those are the ways that I have sort of come to think of it.
Yeah. Especially if there's a dragon in the story, that is one great way to be able to tell if it's fantasy or not. When you said your quote about like the Once Upon a Time opener to the fantasy story, that reminded me of
Yeah.
Dragon Tales, which I loved as a kid, where I think the opening theme song and like the egg and whatever, like that, all the colors of that sequence were just such a great opener to a fantastic show in my memory. Some other fantasy media that I enjoyed growing up. Well, I've already mentioned it like 20 billion times on this podcast, but Magic Tree House. After thinking more about it, I realized that Magic Tree House was much more fantasy than it actually was like historical fiction, because there were actually a lot of supernatural elements in there. There was the characters of Camelot and Arthur's frolic of knights, whatever they were called, and Morgan Le Fay, and just like creatures and things that could not be scientifically explained. I read a mom blogger writing about whether she would recommend Magic Tree House, and one of the, she has several reasons that she wouldn't, but one of them was that the Jack and Annie, who are two elementary-aged kids, in every book, they sneak out of the house away from their parents all the time, and they have their awesome adventures, and then they sneak back in. And there's no consequences of sneaking out and lying. And this, like, that's one of the main reasons that this mom was like upset, not like upset, but just like disapproving of the series. And I thought that was fascinating because to me, the sneaking out was like one of the best parts of the series as a kid. Of course, I was such a good kid. I would never dream of, actually sneaking out. But the fantasy of being able to sneak out of the house in the dead of night, have some fun adventures, and then come back, like, you get to kind of, it's like you have your own little life that your parents don't really, like, need to worry about. But you're also safe. You don't die, and I don't know, it was a great series as a kid.
Well, and here's the thing, Avery. They are able to sneak out because they are in touch with the magic.
Ah, yeah,
It's like
yeah.
the magic gives them permission, right?
Yeah.
And so that is kind of a little bit of power. And there are so many stories where kids, because they are in touch with something that adults are not in tune with, kind of say, well, you know what? It's up to us. The adults are nowhere near this. I'm thinking Wrinkle in Time. I'm thinking Harry Potter. But there are many, many instances. I love that the mom blogger was concerned about that.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, you know what, your kids, they may go looking for a treehouse in the backyard, but I really don't think they're going to get up in the middle of the night and think that a treehouse is going to come get them.
That's true, yeah. And I hope, kids that read this book don't find a random actual treehouse that belongs to somebody else, because there are people out there who can be kind of territorial about their property. So that is a good point, that at some point the reader has to delineate reality versus fantasy. Oh, that also reminds me that I had a coworker once who said that he was raised Christian, uh, and he wasn't allowed to read Percy Jackson. And when I first heard that, I was raised more Buddhist slash like not really super religious, and so I hadn't even thought of the fact that somebody else could determine, that series like wasn't right. Like I grew up reading and watching so much fantasy that it got to the point where my parents, when my siblings or I misbehaved, my parents would be like, they would blame it on the books, they would blame it on the media and the video games, and it was like fantasy was my way of being able to connect to a more functional lifestyle, or like a place where I could be in control and explore. Fantasy always just felt so universal to me that even when the fantasy talks about like mythology and deities, like I was learning about them because those things are relevant to other cultures and also they're not real. But when I'm trying to interpret it from my coworker's like Christian upbringing, how I don't remember if he was told not to or if he didn't want to, or it might have been both. But like, isn't that interesting how fantasy can also be so cultural as well?
Oh, absolutely. And fantasy and religion can kind of intersect too. As your coworker discovered, there was a whole panic, of course, in the 1980s about Dungeons and Dragons and how it might pull kids away from doing what they were quote unquote supposed to do, how it introduced dark magic, and that could mess some kids up. There was another panic over Harry Potter back in its heyday when people were concerned that it would pull kids away from Christian values. But when I was a kid, I'll throw one of the examples from when I was a kid, and that is, of course, the Chronicles of Narnia, which was a many people call it an allegory for Christianity because it's got a whole separate world where there's a Christ-like figure in Aslan the lion. I think C.S. Lewis, the author, always said this is not an allegory. This is Christianity written for kids so that they can understand it. And it is, Aslan is the character of Jesus, just in a different form. So when I was a kid, I wasn't catching the Christian allegories really. I was just looking at kids having a great time going through this sort of coming of age where they would save this whole other magical world. They would get to talk to animals. There were talking animals. That was
Yeah.
amazing. They got magic weapons, and they just tromped all through this magical world. And interestingly, in the Chronicles of Narnia, once the kids grew out of childhood, they were no longer able to return to Narnia until the very, very end of the series. So there would be other kids that would kind of like come in and they had a cousin and then the cousin's friend and so forth. And there were other kids who would come in and sort of pick up the pieces from where the original four Heaven Seas had kind of left off. But at the very end, and this is going to be a big spoiler, but this particular series has been around since the 1940s and 50s, so sorry guys. In the very end, the book called The Last Battle, the character of Aslan essentially enacts the apocalypse on Narnia. And the kids, all of the humans who have been part of Narnia from the very beginning, except one, and that's a whole other story, all of the kids get pulled back into Narnia to see it die, and then they go on to Aslan's country, essentially Narnian heaven. And the really interesting thing is that the kids that you've been following all the way through the series have died on Earth in a train accident. And so this is their death. And I think I can only guess at what was going on with C.S. Lewis, but I mean, I know that he wanted to make the idea of what does Christian theology really indicate to kids? How do we teach kids about something that is very big, very, very old, and very loaded? And how do we teach kids about what possibly the world is moving towards. So, a really fascinating overlap between religion and fantasy in that series.
Wow, yeah. I think I actually only read the first book of Narnia because my mom bought it one day because I liked horses as a kid, and so there was a horse and there was a Pegasus on the cover of The Magician's Nephew, which is the first book. So that was the only Narnia
Yes.
book I've read. But yeah, another TV series that kind of plays on the Narnia concept is The Magicians. Well, I think it was a book series, and I think there's some graphic novels, and yeah, but The Magicians, which is basically a darker adult version of the Magic College and kind of Narnia-esque world concept. And that world, I mean, when you mentioned the train crash, like that's pretty dark.
Oh, yeah.
Is that told in like a serious way, or is it just kind of like a whimsical thing that just happens?
No, I mean, it's very serious, but it's also kind of like your job here on Earth is done. Now you are with me, Aslan, and we are putting Narnia to bed, right? Essentially, it's just kind of like it's almost more Hindu, I
Mm.
suppose, in that you have a single soul, and you. I don't think C.S. Lewis would have liked this reading, but heck, man, I'm talking now. You have a single soul through Earth and Narnia and Aslan's country, and now you are joining with the other souls that are present in Aslan's country. It's kind of like your work on these worlds is done, and now you get to
Mm.
escape from that.
Mm. Yeah, that's a really interesting interpretation of the magical world and what it kind of serves for the humans in the regular world. Yeah,
Oh,
with
yeah.
the magicians, I think the protagonist, he grew up reading a book series similar to Narnia, and then when he finds out that it was actually real, it's such a it's not entirely a nightmare because there are like some good parts of it, but man, oh man, is that show dark and tragic, and does every character just sacrifice and like barely save the world. And it was such a interesting watch for me as somebody who was always really into fantasy, but I don't like you would think that I wouldn't enjoy it because, do you, as an adult, the question is, do I want my fantasy worlds to continue to be a safe place and like full of joy and wonder? Like, but I think the fact that The Magicians is so popular and successful while being dark and violent and tragic, I think that the way that fantasy can be for different audiences of different age groups is so impressive at how versatile of a genre it is.
Absolutely. Yeah, you return to it years later and you find new things, new discoveries.
Yeah.
What else did you like when you were a
I
kid?
also loved Skyrim. I put like 5 exclamation points after that because I I have a tattoo of one of the dragon shouts in Skyrim. So it's basically like, medieval fantasy world. You fight like all kinds of creatures and do all kinds of things because you're the dragonborn and you can talk to dragons and you're kind of the chosen one. And there's there's different dragon shouts that you collect, and you learn how to like just basically be the best, most boss warrior in all the land. And one of the shouts is Lokvakor, which is clear skies. It just basically clears the weather for like 60 seconds, which sometimes you need it for like a specific quest where there's a blizzard and then you just gotta clear it for a bit. So it's kind of the most useless shout, but I do have a tattoo of that because Skyrim has always been so it was a big part of my video game journey of because it was one of the biggest ones that I had played, and it's open world too. And so getting to experience a fantasy world in an open world, which means that you can go wherever you want, you can do anything. You can even like get married, and then your spouse can still run the shop so that you can just go on your adventures, come back home to your spouse who just lives at home now, but you just can collect all the money that they earned and then be on your way, go adventure again for 6 months. It was great. I always loved that sense of adventure and traveling and discovery and all that.
I think that Skyrim and a lot of games that kind of have fantasy at their core, magic at their core, are riffing on the rise of Dungeons and Dragons in the 70s and 80s and everything that opened up. And I was there for kind of the very beginning of Dungeons and Dragons. I had the classic red box basic set. And man, I loved the character classes and the monsters and the maps. I drew maps endlessly as a kid. Endlessly. I loved creating different worlds. I loved creating different dungeons or different houses or castles. And so Dungeons and Dragons opened up, I think, for us Gen X folks who were into that geeky stuff, it opened up a whole lot, whether it was looking at history in a different way or looking at monsters and creatures in a different way and looking at the mythology behind some of the Dungeons and Dragons creatures was really fun. And also, it created this opportunity for video game after video game after video game, whether they were dungeon crawls slash roguelike type games, or whether they were more, like you said, open world and exploring all the different things that could be done. So I think I spent so much time with things like Baldur's Gate and Might and Magic and The Bard's Tale. Those are the three that I really remember. They were quest based, so you had to do one quest in order to get some MacGuffin that you needed to move on. Your party changed in a lot of those games as you went along, particularly in Baldur's Gate. You would think, "Oh man, I really need a better thief now. So I've got to get Imoen. I've got to add her to the party or something like that." So Dungeons, it's hard to overstate the impact of Dungeons and Dragons and bringing fantasy to pop culture in the way that it did and to gaming in the 80s. I mean, it was a whole shift.
Yeah. And when you mentioned the word quest, that totally rang a light bulb bell in my head because quests are such a central part of fantasy in so many stories.
Absolutely. And just borrowing from mythology, whether it's Greek mythology with like the quest for the Golden Fleece, for example, or Arthurian mythology with the quest to find the Holy Grail. Mythology flavors all of this different fantasy stuff that we have this very rich tapestry of multiple cultures influencing all these different stories that we have. So it's a great time for fantasy now. And I see that you have on your list Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli
Yeah.
also. For a Japanese point of view on fantasy, specifically a post war Japanese point of view, and all the different stories that Miyazaki tells.
Yeah. And I think with Kiki's Delivery Service as an example, in that story, the protagonist, she's just it's just like a coming of age story where she's trying to figure out her witch powers and like use her witch powers for good. It doesn't always work out the way that she wants it to, and then all of a sudden she's not able to use her powers for some reason, and she just has to kind of figure out how to just like she has to figure out how to overcome like her internal barriers to whatever it is that's causing her problems. And a lot of these Miyazaki movies deal with those sorts of themes, like with My Neighbor Totoro, the two female characters are dealing with the grief of their mother falling ill and the fear of kind of what it means to grow up and be an adult and deal with real world problems, but having to figure out how to use your imagination and your sense of hope to power through that in order to just continue to be alive in a not debilitating way.
And I also want to give a shout out to an author who's a tiny bit more obscure, but was a big part of my childhood, and that is John Bellairs. So John Bellairs wrote he's probably best known for The House with a Clock in Its Walls, which was made into a movie with Jack Black that wasn't terribly successful, but John Bellairs wrote a whole series of books about kids who were sort of caught in these gothic fantasy magical conundrums, and typically they're standing up against magic users who adults don't believe, except for some key adults. Adults don't believe are a threat at all, and the kids are just they're making things up, or they're too sensitive or whatever. And so the kids are left to fight some really frightening monsters and ghosts and dark magic to push back against what's going on. And in one of the series, there's this kid named Johnny, and he is friends with a professor next door. So Johnny goes to Catholic school, and he's very involved in the church. And they also have a good friend who is a priest named Father Higgins. And so Johnny and his friend Fergie and the professor and Father Higgins almost use like Catholic, you could call it magic, I suppose, Catholic spirituality to try and counter what's going on with these dark magic users. And so these series were incredibly compelling. Just the fact that a kid could stand up against the high stakes of what was going on. And another really cool thing about these series, about the Bellairs stuff, was that the covers and the internal illustrations were done by the artist Edward Gorey. Okay, so Edward Gorey, a fascinating guy. We could almost do like a whole thing about gothic horror and Gorey's take on it. He did a whole design for a production of Dracula once. And then when I was a kid, I used to watch with my mom the show on PBS called Mystery. And Edward Gorey did the beginning title sequences. And so he's very, very, or he's gone now. He was very, very specific. It's kind of an Edwardian, spooky kind of vibe with well-dressed people and detectives and then frightening creatures. And so the illustrations were so evocative, and they really prepared you for what was going to be inside those books. And so besides reading those books, all right, I'm going to make a confession here, Avery, and that is that in every book I read, I found a character who I really connected with and felt an affinity for. And sometimes I would read that character's lines, I would read the dialogue in the book as if I were that character. And I don't think I'm the only person who does this. I think there are other people who do this too. But there's just a little, and that is highly personal play, right? Just trying to voice whatever the character is saying. And almost sometimes there are charms or spells, or in the case of the Bellairs stuff, sometimes prayers that you voice because the character is saying it in the book. And sometimes I almost expected as a kid that something might happen if I said whatever the character was saying.
A recent fantasy book that I read is called Iron Widow by Shirin J. Zhao. And it's a young adult science fantasy novel released in 2021. And it was pitched as kind of The Handmaid's Tale meets Pacific Rim. And it's a mecha reimagining of the rise of China's first and only female emperor, Wu Zetian, set in the nation of Huaxia. a futuristic reinterpretation of medieval China. And this was probably the first fantasy book that I've read that features kind of an Asian fantastical setting with characters. And this book features the female protagonist's story of rage and revenge at the misogynistic system that is the world that this futuristic world is. And she goes about overturning it in a really cutthroat way that was actually extremely pleasurable and emotional to read. And like the fact that the character is dealing with so much feminist rage, and she's also like a morally gray protagonist too. And then there's all these like Chinese history Easter eggs, and the storyline also involves like fake marriage for the cameras and childhood friends to lovers and actual smashing of the patriarchy, and also mecha battles, just battles with huge like technological feats. But like actually smashing the patriarchy like in its face is such a all around wonderful way to enjoy a fantasy novel. And also there's a love triangle where all the three characters make their own decisions to also pursue each other polyamorously too. And that was also my first time reading of a healthy, well, as healthy as you can be while you're all, warriors who are overtaking the empire in a bloodthirsty way. But like being able to have a polyamorous love triangle is also pretty rare for young adult fiction because in a lot of like fantasy, young adult fiction, there are love triangles too. Like in what is it, the Mortal Instruments series, which is by Cassandra Clare, which I also read a bunch of. Is just had like all the typical like elves and like monsters and stuff, and you're a shadow hunter, but oh no, I'm falling in love with like two different like it's just I don't know. There's always, but even the love triangle trope it's all over media anyway. So maybe that's like a whole nother discussion too. But this book was such a wonderful non-Western book to read, and it was like I'm like right there with the characters and just battling with these ginormous mecha creatures, and the fact that it's in the first person is also a really exciting way to portray these characters. And the the part about, power and how these characters are fighting to regain the power that society denies them is kind of one of the biggest themes of the book. And growing up, like I was always kind of discouraged to express my anger or really any dissatisfaction of the way that my family was or the way that society was. And there were so many concrete ways. Like one of the ways that the character, was suffering was because she had her feet bound as a child. And in certain Chinese groups, I don't know if they, still do it, but it's definitely a long-standing, centuries-long tradition in China, in certain areas of China at least, to bind your feet, which is basically crushing them into a square shape. And not everybody, just women. I forgot to mention that. Just women, so that they can be eligible for marriage and, pleasing men in society and all that. But the fact that this female protagonist's feet are bound, it causes her like a lifetime of pain, and like it's a disability because she's not able to walk or run properly like other people. And so she deals with like that as a concrete example, and in a historically accurate example too, of the inequality that she faces on a day to day, and her anger at not only that, but just every other huge and little thing that the government and the society denies her. It powers her to kind of just take on all of that by herself. And so like she starts out just like as a normal, peasant girl, but her power starts with her rage to pursue revenge, and then she's able to kind of gain and access the technological magical power that she's able to harness. And I think there's so many like good allusions too to how like only only the wealthy are able to kind of access technology and magic in this world too. It's just I just went on a really exciting journey, and the journey was very dangerous, but I was not in any actual danger. And the fact that she reimagined historical China into kind of a fictional reinterpretation of it was also what made this fantasy story so wonderful too. Like the reimagining of not really, the author wasn't trying to remain perfectly historically accurate. Instead, they were able to take parts of the historical culture while combining it with kind of futuristic reimaginings in the lens of also modern day issues, themes, and problems. So yeah, that is a favorite book of this year for sure. Iron Widow.
Yay. Sold.
Yay.
Amazing. In terms of non-Western looks at fantasy, because I'm going to have a little more to say later on about the whiteness, maleness of and straightness of fantasy for many, many years,
Yeah.
particularly in the Pulp Fiction days. But now that there are many, many populations who want to play in the fantasy sandbox and have found their way in, a couple that I have been looking at recently are Zen Cho's Sorcerer to the Crown series, which is about a sorcerer in, I think the setting is Victorian Britain. It's either Georgian Britain or Victorian Britain, which came right after. And the sorcerer of the title is of African descent, and he is making his way in polite society and also trying to kind of help reinvigorate the magic that has been lost in the British Isles. So that has been really exciting. And then S.A. Chakraborty's City of Brass series. And this is a new take on the Arabian Nights tales. So you have jinn and you have all kinds of exciting uh, Arabian Nights style creatures and magic going on. And the central character is finding her power and trying to figure out how she is more important in society than she thought she was. And so, kind of a hidden heritage thing. That's another nice trope. What do you have inside you that you were not aware of, and how does it connect you to something that's great and powerful? So yeah, lots of news stories being told.
Nice. Yeah. There's also a movie that I really loved this past year. Watched it a couple times. It was Suzumi, directed by Makoto Shinkai, who's already released like a bunch of other movies. Very trademark, not trademarked, very stylized of like pretty CGI, and usually talks about like a girl and a guy who fall in love. But in this movie, well, there's a girl and a guy who fall in love in Suzumi, but the guy turns into a chair near the beginning, and so Suzumi is a girl who just is dealing with the trauma of losing her mother in a national tragedy when she was a kid, which was a real event, the March 11th, 2011 Great East Japan Earthquake, which is the most powerful recorded earthquake in Japan. And this movie ties kind of the themes of that personal loss that many Japanese people, remember to this day, of course, because it was pretty recent. But tying this grief and loss story also into kind of a fantastical monster story as well, because there's Suzumi and the other guy have to seal away these giant worms that are like uh, demonic creatures just trying to cause destruction with like big earthquakes and stuff. But there's kind of like the Shinto concepts of how there's deities protecting the land, but how people have forgotten the deities to a point where now the darkness is trying to reach out from the afterlife and just basically crush the world and stuff. So going along with the theme of like self-discovery and human problems, it's like the same thing when we were talking about whether we're talking about playing with monsters or playing with literally anything else, there's always gonna come down to kind of a human element of the stories, which is what makes the stories relevant to us, regardless of, what color the creatures are or whether the guy turns back from a chair into a human again or not, is about the protagonist and the heroes dealing with who they are as a person and what they can overcome in order to save themselves and just move on from the challenges that persist in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked a little bit around the idea of power. Maybe we should kind of nail that down a little bit too. I think some classic examples of magic being connected with power are, of course, Tolkien and the One Ring, and the idea that one particular artifact can give power over literally everything else in the world. And Tolkien had survived, I mean, for through World War One and World War Two, and was looking at how power could be solidified in one person in the way that it was in those, especially under the Third Reich, and especially under one person's drive to conquer all of Europe and bring a specific evil frame to everything that was conquered. And so the treachery of Sauron creating the One Ring when the other ring recipients of the Rings of Power thought, oh, we're going to share this power equally. And as Kate Blanchett, as Galadriel says, but they were all of them deceived. And so the idea that power can be consolidated in one person with incredible scope. Of course, there are, I think you'll say a little bit more about this, but there are bloodlines, family lines. Sometimes there's raw ability to tap into the power of magic. I will talk about, of course, one of my favorite universes ever, and that is Avatar: The Last Airbender, and how some characters have bending ability, and what that means, and how it is brought forth. Of course, the Avatar has the ability to bend in all four of the forms, and so fire, earth, water, and air has to master all of those elements in order to be the Avatar. And then there are characters who, like Sokka, for example, are good strategists, but don't have access to any bending. And so Avatar asks questions, I guess, about what is power and are there other kinds of power that are equivalent to bending power, especially when we get into Legend of Korra.
Yeah.
And technology and other kinds of things. And of course, there are board games of all of these worlds, or at least most of them. There's a sense of power corrupting and pushing back. In many games about Lord of the Rings, for example, you have to carry the ring in certain parts, but it will corrupt you if you hold it for too long. And then, of course, martial arts and its connection with the bending in The Last Airbender, and playful, so many YouTube videos about bending, and I'm a firebender, and so look at these different techniques that I use, and I'm going to show them off in this YouTube video, for example. And all bending is rooted in various East Asian approaches to martial arts and approaches to moving the body around in order to accomplish different tasks.
Yeah. I grew up learning Kung Fu too, and also watching Avatar: The Last Airbender, so naturally my siblings and I were often practicing bending / martial arts techniques on each other in friendly, magical ways. One other way that magic can manifest, well, I think in the Miyazaki or Studio Ghibli films, there's often the theme of nature and how nature is restorative and healing, but also full of spirits and creatures and magic as well. And there's also in the book Circe by Madeline Miller, which is an adaptation of the legends around the Greek goddess Circe. This character does descend from godly lineage, but she's kind of outcasted on an island to a point where she learns how to harness magic from magical plants. And that becomes her ultimate skill set and power, and she's able to deal with violent men who run onto her island by turning them into guinea pigs and stuff. And that's kind of quite a way to take back your power, is to kind of harness magic to use it to protect yourself. And that's also another question that is always in these kind of fantasy stories, is what do you use your power to do? Who do you save? Who do you choose to hurt? And also what happens if it's gone one day too. One of the movies I mentioned earlier was My Neighbor Totoro, which I watched a good amount of times during Chinese school growing up, but we watched it with Chinese dubs and subtitles so that we could practice our Chinese. It's a universal thing in every language class. It's like you put on a movie, but you put it on in a language that you're learning, and that's totally educational. But Totoro, this big, fluffy woodland spirit, he teaches the protagonist about like being brave and channeling your imagination and humor and hope in order to be brave, rather than just like repress your emotions. Like I said earlier, they're dealing with grief, and so sometimes the best way to power through your challenging times is just to laugh or roar back at your fears. Adults are often, full of repression, whereas this woodland spirit is able to remind the children that, remaining hopeful and resourceful rather than being full of despair is a often better way to solve your problems or deal with difficult situations. And there's also like the reverence for the acorn as it's like the acorns in this movie are like actually gold. Oh, they're not real gold, but they shine like gold. They're valuable. They represent a potential for growth and change. And I mean, isn't it pretty magical that a tiny little seed becomes a giant tree? Like that's pretty magical if I ever had to reevaluate that myself. I mean, nature is real life magic, is kind of what Miyazaki's saying. Nature is comfort and stability, and it's here to be revered and thanked. And that's kind of, that's as great of a lesson as a big, fluffy, bunny-looking creature could teach us. And he's such an iconic, there's so much Totoro merch. I mean, there's so much Ghibli merch. Like, there's merch for his stuff everywhere. But, like, that's kind of partly how iconic it is, but also like never forget how iconic the stories around them are, is all I'm saying.
There are a lot. I mean, obviously Totoro is the the icon of Studio Ghibli in general. There are so many other creatures that studio has created, like the soot sprites and the no face character and Ponyo. I could go on and on and on and on. I mean, we're just scratching the surface.
Oh, absolutely.
But the worlds that are built by Studio Ghibli and are the thing. Okay, all right. The thing I love about the fantasy that comes out of Studio Ghibli is that it is simultaneously so Japanese and so universal.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at these stories, you see Japan, or at least as an outsider, I see Japan and what it values in terms of Shinto, in terms of harmony, in terms of looking at violence and the effects of violence, in terms of looking at loss and recovery, the country versus the city, particularly post-war Japan, looking at all of these things that are specific to Japanese culture, at least as I understand it. And then you can watch these movies from anywhere in any language, as you pointed out, and understand something about childhood or something about the magic of nature or something about the magic that we all have inside us and the strength that it takes to access it. It's just absolutely fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Disney, the connections between Disney and what Walt Disney did kind of in a Western frame, and then what Miyazaki and Ghibli have done in an Eastern frame, both creating very specific approaches to fantasy. And it's not only the movies, Avery, it's how kids and adults play out these characters every single day. And it's just absolutely fascinating that they are so widespread, beloved, and informative.
Yeah.
So, while we're on the subject of creatures, you have talked about dragons. We all love dragons. And to me, dragons are a symbol of strength and power and exclusivity, especially if there's a rider. How does the rider bond with the dragon? I will throw out another amazing series, and that is Naomi Novik's Temeraire series, also known as the His Majesty's Dragon series, which, Avery, if you have not read this series, I highly recommend it. It's kind of like Jane Austen meets dragons in fantasy. It's a
Ooh.
retelling of the Napoleonic Wars with dragons as an air force,
Oh, wow.
as aerial units.
Oh, my gosh.
And it's really fascinating. There are some strong female characters, there are queer characters. Novik is throwing everything into the sandbox to play with. And the way that the main dragon rider bonds with the dragon Temeraire is very much about reading what's in somebody's soul, right? So a dragon makes a choice about who to bond with and why. And that is incredibly important in the beginning. And the books are narrated from the point of view of the rider, whose name is Lawrence, Captain Lawrence, and then Temeraire the dragon. So we have dragons, unicorns. Avery, I love unicorns.
Yes.
Unicorns and Pegasi.
Yes.
Unicorns, to me, purity, beauty, and healing. We have elves. There are a lot of different kinds of elves, from the Tolkien-esque, beautiful, natural kind of elves to smaller elf characters that are a little more comical. Mermaids. Oh my gosh. Okay, mermaids. My daughter used to watch this Australian show. There were actually two shows. One was called H2O, and one
Yes.
was called Mako Mermaids. You know these shows?
Yeah, yep.
Talk about Australian fantasy. I mean, contemporary Australian fantasy. And if the girls got wet, they turned into their mermaid form. And so they had individual powers. There were sort of master storylines and things like that. But the thing that was really interesting to me was who knew the girls' secrets.
Mm-hmm.
This is very much like Miraculous Ladybug. Who knows the secrets about who Ladybug and Cat Noir really are? Secret identities, secret combinations with magic, a magic self and a non-magic self, but you're kind of both at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was Mako Mermaids and H2O. We used to play those stories in the pool. Also Ariel, the Little Mermaid, and I used to play mermaids with my daughter all the time. Were there pearls that she was diving for? What was going on? Where could she hide from the people who were going to discover she was a mermaid? Swimming pools, by the way, great places for fantastical play.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was very, very strongly woven into kind of my life as a father at that stage. Fairies. There was a Rainbow Magic series with fairies, and we played those as well. And I remember when I would read the fairies, the red fairy or the blue fairy or whatever they were, or the Halloween fairy. This series just went on and on and on. The author was Daisy Meadows, which was a pseudonym. And whenever I read the fairies to Julian, I would read them in my really bad Irish accent, and I would say, I'm the Red Fairy. Hello, it's nice to meet you. I have a problem. Can you girls help me out with it? I mean, it was like straight up Lucky Charms type
Oh
accent.
my
But
gosh.
fairies, fairies are delicate but tough. Those wings, even though they look like gossamer wings and they could disintegrate at a touch, fairies are a lot tougher than we give them credit for. So those are a few other creatures that have woven their way into my life and my play.
Nice. Another movie with a really cool fantasy character is Over the Moon, which is a Netflix movie released in the past few years. It it, it involves the myth of Chang'e and Houyi, which is it's kind of the origin of some of the moon myths around in Chinese culture and often related with the Mid-Autumn Festival and mooncakes. And basically the female protagonist, who's a young girl, she's grieving the loss of her mom, and she builds an actual rocket to go to the moon to find this mythical character Chang'e, who we find out this woman is now a goddess and pop star who is also grieving her husband, and so these two characters kind of bond both over their mutual grief, and they're able to kind of process it. And I don't know, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to that movie since it was a really interesting retelling of a Chinese myth that I had talked about a lot as a kid.
Nice. I think another area to explore is fandom. And we talked a little bit about how we play individually and maybe a tiny bit about how we play as groups. But fandom and its connection with fantasy is very strong. I will talk about cosplay quite a bit here, and that is especially I see medieval garb and Renaissance garb, and this is really interesting because I think these two periods kind of slide into each other, Avery,
Hmm.
particularly at things like Ren fairs. I don't know that there's a lot of distinguishing between this would be something that Western Europeans would have worn in, say, 800 versus 1600. It kind of all combines and mushes together, which is kind of interesting. So I see robes, I see capes and hoods, I see people with armor, I see barmaid outfits, a whole bunch of different outfits when people are playing medieval, playing fantasy, playing Renaissance. I think for some of these outfits embodying times when lives were exciting, or at least some lives were, right? The stakes were high, things mattered, things you did mattered, and you were out doing a whole bunch of things. You were raising animals, you were working with wood, and you were going on journeys and seeing what you could find if you were allowed to
Hmm.
in a feudal society. Or as you slide into Renaissance, what is it like to suddenly be buying and selling things and sacks of gold and creating potions and alchemy and all kinds of things like that? So I think there's a lot of wish fulfillment. If you said to somebody who is kind of fanish for fantasy, why would you want to live in a time where medicine was not great and where uh, people, especially sort of hygiene and life was short? I think people might say, well, because it was a magical time. It was a time when people felt like magic might be side by side with real life in almost like a Shinto way, right?
Hmm.
Magic all around us, spirits all around us, and trying to navigate that before the rise of science. So that's the kind of cosplay that I have seen in various places.
Yeah, and I think a lot of queer communities enjoy cosplaying and involving themselves in fantasy communities in this way, just because queer people have historically already been ostracized, and nowadays we are celebrating the fantastical, and there are tons of modern events nowadays that where most people are encouraged to, cosplay or roleplay in these kinds of story scenarios. And so I think it just goes hand in hand with the arc of, queer culture as a whole, is how much we resonate with magic and fantasy. And due to the internet as well, fan fiction is able to be almost, if not more prolific than the original content that it actually began with. I mean, the sheer amount of Draco and Harry fan fiction in the world
Oh
is
my gosh.
unbelievable. To this day, the Harry Potter universe still has fan fiction coming out about it. This even inspired some of Rainbow Rowell's books, such as Fangirl, which is about a girl who writes, Draco slash Harry sort of fan fiction, like, off brand. And then Rainbow Rowell also released Carry On, which is the embodiment of that female protagonist's fan fiction as its own standalone novel. And I read both of these, and it was so satisfying. Because you get to read about these two characters who, in other stories, normally are just like regular straight cishet guys, like, who just don't fall in love. Like, why are they not falling in love? Make them fall in love now. And a lot of this comes from the desire for queer representation in our mainstream media. And there can always be more canonical queerness, like, please, all the time. And there is so much room for more of what people want to see. Like, fans, maybe, maybe fans can see a certain spark between two characters that the author didn't envision. And the fans can then create that in their own way, either through writing it out or creating fan art or cosplaying it. And they can create stories that extend from that world and all the way, like, to their own imaginations. And it's honestly, it's kind of magical because, like, as an author or creator, you're planting a seed, and then somebody else on the other side of the world sees something in that seed and then wants to expand it even more so for themselves. And fan fiction can be like nice and called fluff, or it can be angsty, and it can even involve crossovers with other media worlds that probably won't be created by the mainstream, but at least you can create it for yourself because that's what art is about for you.
Absolutely. If you look at the name of Archive of Our Own, also known as AO3, just look at that title, Archive of Our Own, taking control as a group and making it into a whole separate library. So I love what you were saying about if you don't see what you want to see in canon, then create an archive or a canon that is close to your heart, right?
Hmm.
Such a playful, and it's playful in an individual way, but then it's playful in a group way as different fic writers respond to each other. And so there's a lot going on with what are the alternatives if you don't like what canon is giving you, but you want to use the world and you want to use the characters. How playful can you be?
Hmm. Of course, I cannot deign to mention Draco and Harry without giving more commentary on my thoughts on the Harry Potter universe as a whole. If you're ready for this,
Okay.
which I know.
I'm ready, and I'm definitely in your corner.
Yeah. I like many others grew up with Harry Potter a ton. It was everything to my childhood. I I kid you not, I read the first book or two starting in first grade. Like, I was that nerdy and ahead of the game. Like, I put the second book on my book report, and my teacher thought I was lying, and I had to, like, plead with her that I wasn't. And I grew up with, like, Jim Dale's audiobooks, listening to it while I was falling asleep. I loved Pottermore, some of the computer games, and all of that. Like, I loved being immersed in that world as a kid. And then, of course, J.K. Rowling reveals that she's a transphobic person, reveals a lot of transphobia, just as one corner of what she reveals to be her true self. And it kind of causes huge ripples throughout the world regarding how fans of her work can now or now are forced to kind of deal with this. And it raises these questions of art and the artist and what are the power dynamics between the creator and the fans of a creation. And there's always going to be this scenario when we talk about art and playful worlds because there's no getting around it. Like there's gonna be a human. Well, I don't know about AI, but in usually nowadays there will be a human in charge of creating our stuff. And the part of fantasy that is an illusion is kind of like fantasy is supposed to be an illusion, but a lot of us don't feel like the whole act of art itself is also going to be an illusion in that we're going to find out, or like when we find out about what the author's true internal intentions are, and if those intentions are evil and discriminatory and, harm other people, that basically taints the entire universe that the author created. And there's different ways to deal with this. Like either you can go no contact with the source material, you can purge all your related artifacts. Speaking of which, there was a tweet that said, "Reminder: Harry Potter tattoos have a higher regret rate than trans surgeries," and that's very funny actually, and I agree with that. And or you could either still engage in the universe, in the playful universe of this world, or you can engage with it through fan fiction, while having disclaimers of not supporting the author's views. Like what? Like I mean, Harry Potter is such a large scale, thing that there's like it's all out of her control now. Like she planted so many seeds of like joy and love and like exploration and magic and everywhere throughout the world, and just now it's just like quite an injury. It's a betrayal. There's an illusion that's now been shattered as an adult that now I and many others are no longer comfortable kind of engaging with the Harry Potter universe at all.
Yeah, there have been a few different periods where artists have created something that then gets taken and reshaped and reformed. Rowling is a great example. And also, if you're looking at H.P. Lovecraft, who was, by all reports, a very angry person, a very hateful person, and yet created a whole bunch of weird fantasy in the Call of Cthulhu and other kinds of worlds that combine with Cthulhu back in the early 20th century. If you look at Lovecraft Country, the show that was recently on TV, and the way that the writers of that have taken all of Lovecraft stuff and made it positive for people of color, for example, and have just absolutely taken Lovecraft's hate and made it into something where it's open to be owned by all kinds of creators and all kinds of audiences. So,
Mm.
yeah, playfulness. And I think that I just had a couple of notes in terms of when we take a look at fantasy and we think, oh, I don't know about that in these ways. I know a lot of people are challenged by C.S. Lewis's Christian focus, his Anglican focus, very, very strong Anglican focus with the Narnia stuff, as well as his focus on Western Europe as kind of the center of his Narnia universe. There's another country called Calormen that worships a different deity, and then those who were worshiping that deity do not get to go into Aslan's country at the end. He was adamant about his Christian focus, and he did focus on Aslan as the ideal, right? The ideal, and a character who was both frightening and kind at the same time, which was pretty fascinating. And so I see the challenges when people look at C.S. Lewis's work, but also I think that the man himself had a great love for others, had a great sort of desire to learn more, keep growing, and especially teach children how to always be curious and never lose their imaginations. And I hope and I believe that C.S. Lewis wanted to show people through his work, whether it's Narnia or whether it's his science fiction series or whether it's his other writings, because he wrote a lot of theological stuff, he wrote a lot of letters, all kinds of different things. A desire to really show people how to be their best in society and how to hopefully live in a way that respected and was kind to other people. And another thing that I've seen kind of breaking down here with romantasy that I have been reading lately, which is just what it says on the tin, a mashup of romance and fantasy, is this whole concept of the bad boy character becoming the love interest. So, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
A Court of Thorns and Roses, Fourth Wing, the list goes on. Those are the two. I just, oh man. And I wonder what girls are getting out of this, or young women, or young gay men reading these particular pieces and wanting a guy like these quasi dangerous guys, these Byronic heroes, like Lord Byron. And I think that this kind of comes from Gothic literature too, but I gotta tell you, Avery, I am pretty tired of these jerky guys just kind of like getting the heterosexual girl main characters to just kind of fall in love with them. So that's been kind of a pet peeve of mine recently.
Well, romantasy is actually among some of the genres that are getting banned a lot in schools these days.
Mm.
We love that recent phenomenon of governments and schools banning books, most or many of which are fantasy or graphic novels. And conservative politicians and parents are mostly the ones driving this kind of boycott, I guess, if you could call it that, where almost all of these books are dealing with race, gender, sexuality, and intersections thereof. And sometimes only because they just have a few swear words, or if there's heavy themes like death or coming out. Literature is supposed to be a place of community and safe haven, especially for those who've been excluded from traditional narratives. And banning books in this way kind of makes schools feel less welcoming and has been proven to affect the mental health and graduation rates of students themselves. Like how inclusive the curriculum and the library is has a huge effect on the students' outcomes and what they experience. And this is coming up in, like, I had to just address this in our fantasy talk because as much as humans love to play with fantasy, there's going to be so many people who are going to try to control like literal fantasy as a genre, and also like psychologically speaking too, like 1984 style, people are basically out there to control what we think about and what we want the world to be. Like, one of the books that I was so shocked when I discovered that it was on the list of banned books was Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. It's been banned many times, and the story itself critiques censorship in society. I'm flabbergasted. I'm glad that I read this, as part of my curriculum in high school, and in the world of this book, basically, it's illegal to read or own any books, and firemen are paid people who start fires to burn books instead of stopping fires. And, they don't really ask why they're burning the books, except until one day the protagonist does. But this kind of story, this kind of dystopian fantasy asks, what would you do if you were in the situation? Who would you be if you could choose? And, dystopian is a whole nother genre that I would love to do a whole episode on, but like dystopian fantasy and fiction says, surprise, you're already living in this world. Or you will be soon if you don't do something about it. And my gosh, I just can't believe it. God. What does this world come to?
Uh, And I think asking the question of why these books, why now these books or these worlds or whatever they are, why them? I mentioned before that fantasy and science fiction, we're sticking with fantasy today, but both of them kind of side by side, especially in the pulp era of, say, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, even into the 60s. I feel like it was a very white, male, heterosexual, wish fulfillment sandbox. And it's interesting to me because I think that even though we look at that particular group of people as sort of like being in charge, right? They're the patriarchy, they're the white male straight patriarchy, they're kind of the center of power or what was going on in society, especially post World War II. It wasn't quite enough, Avery. The guys seem to have wanted something more. So if they were businessmen, if they were lawyers, if they were professors, whatever they were still bound by the rules and the realities of this world and this community and this society. And man, they wanted to fly in personal rocket ships.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to save princesses. They wanted to be the characters that the oracles had talked about, right? And they wanted to be special, they wanted to be unique because even though that group of people was kind of like in power and shaping society, they still were bound by the rules of society. So why not create even more interesting rules so that somebody could be a Conan or a Fafnir and the Grey Mouser, these kinds of characters who were warriors or thieves or paladins or had access to magic. Talk about wish fulfillment to kind of the highest degree. So maybe today we're looking back at that sandbox, and I know that there are fans who are kind of like, no, 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 that's my club. You don't get to enter it.
Mm-hmm.
And I have another quote from Ursula Le Guin here, and about kind of what scares people. Why do people want to limit what's going on with fantasy? Here's the quote. For fantasy is true, of course. It isn't factual, but it is true. Children know that. Adults know it too, and that is precisely why many of them are afraid of fantasy. They know that its truth challenges, even threatens all that is false, all that is phony, unnecessary, and trivial in the life they have let themselves be forced into living. They are afraid of dragons because they are afraid of freedom.
Dang, that hits hard.
It hits really hard. Yeah, I know.
One of my favorite ways to continue to play with fantasy has been through immersive environments. I played an escape room in California a while ago at Mine Trap Escape in Temecula. It was called Excalibur. It was very magical, King Arthur and Camelot themed, and it was just me and a couple of my friends just skipping around this little gorgeous castle set with like a little garden, a little church, magical table. There was a talking suit of armor. I mean, it doesn't get more immersive than that. I think if you like touch it at some point, one of the lines they can say is like, well, at least get to know me first. And I always remember that as pretty funny. And you can actually pull a sword from a stone. Enough said. And recently I painted and played a immersive theater and escape room hosted by my school in a local escape room. It was called I Wish. The set consisted of a study with a lot of books and then you would escape through a bookshelf to enter the enchanted woods and then find a cabin in the forest. And there was a sign in front of the cabin that starts out empty, but then as you explore, you find all these different signs that says it's either Red Riding Hood's grandma or like Rapunzel's something or like the baker or different, basically a bunch of different fairy tales. And there's also costume pieces lying around, and once you pick it up and put it on, the live actors will treat you like, that character. Like I think the first one I put on was like a little royal cape, and then the princess and everybody else looked at me and was like, "Oh, hello," and I was so freaked out. I like threw it off. But then then I found a Red Riding Hood, and I was like, "Oh, so this is like a thing." And so I put on the Red Riding Hood, and I was like much more prepared because I was like, "Okay, now I know what I'm getting into." But we got to like collect eggs, talk to birds and mice, bake a pie, plant plants. We even like climbed into an attic via like these steps hidden inside a tree trunk, and yeah, painting that was a lot of fun, but playing it was also like quite a experience as well.
And I think of Fantasyland at the different Disney parks and what that represents. Fantasyland brings together a bunch of different time periods. I mean, everything from Pinocchio to Snow White to Peter Pan to Alice in Wonderland, King Arthur's Carousel, and then even as late as Dumbo. The Dumbo flying elephants are part of Fantasyland at the California park. And so, this space where I guess the idea is anything could happen. These various stories are being told, and they are the realm of fantasy. And so there's a little bit of magic here, a little bit of magic there, and that's what pulls them all together. In the California park, it essentially looks like your standard medieval European village, or slightly after, like a Renaissance, with sort of the Tudor style buildings and that kind of thing, maybe quasi thatched roofs. And so Fantasyland immerses you in this sense of play and fun, but also danger and adventure. And so that's always been pretty interesting. I just got back from Denver, Colorado, where I went to the Meow Wolf installation called Convergence Station. And so this is, I have described this to people as your childhood dreams brought to adult scale.
Oh
And
yeah.
it's just room after room after room. And Convergence Station specifically is a place where different alien races meet, and then you go through a portal and you check out where they have established their kind of like societies. And so one is a little more technological, and one is very much more magical, and it has magic forests growing and all kinds of really beautiful, amazing creatures. And let me tell you, just standing in the center of multiple stories of this particular world is transportative, whatever the word is, if there is a word. It transports you, and it fully brings you into a space where you're not aware of what time it is. You're not really aware of what is going on around you, because you are dropped in this world just as if you would be dropped into any unfamiliar space in the desert or the forest or whatever. And you have to create the meaning, and you have to let the magic kind of guide you. And so that was an immersive experience, different from an escape room where you're trying to solve a particular puzzle, you're trying to interact with things effectively. And it was, Meow Wolf was just straight up open world. You could go where you wanted, you could kind of do a path that made sense to you, you could ignore rooms if they were a little bit too intense, all these kinds of different things. So wonderful, wonderful, wonderful immersive fantasy.
That is so cool. I can't wait to go one day.
Oh, yeah. I guess it's time for final
Yeah,
thoughts.
I guess it is.
I have one more Le Guin quote, and then I'll kind of pass it to you. this is when Le Guin kind of is making her final point, which is, why is fantasy important? Here she is. So I arrive at my personal defense of the uses of the imagination, especially in fiction, and most especially in fairy tale, legend, fantasy, science fiction, and the rest of the lunatic fringe. I believe that maturity is not an outgrowing, but a growing up. That an adult is not a dead child, but a child who survived. And I love the way that she's linking play and imagination and fantasy and the power of fantasy as breaking free of the probable and the possible. And there I'm paraphrasing Rod Serling of Twilight Zone fame. Why stick with the probable and the possible when you can go for the improbable and the impossible? We play, we imagine, we engage with fantasy. I would argue not to escape, but to go deeper and to know each other, our fellow travelers, more fully.
Wow, that is beautiful. I am so happy that fantasy is a part of the playful world that we live in, and it's been a huge part of who I am today and where I hope to keep helping others, experience the world as an artist. And I'm most thankful for all the other artists, writers of color, and of the queer communities, and of other more marginalized identities for sharing their voices and being part of what's making the fantasy world more diverse and more inclusive today. Even though it is quote-unquote fake, it is very, very real. This has been Powered by Play with Avery and Drew. If you've been enjoying this podcast, you can support us online at Ko-fi. That is ko-fi.com/poweredbyplay. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.